Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. I'll be your host and moderator as we present Couple Conflict 101, fights that could grow your relationship. In a few moments, Dr. Graf Grounds will provide keen insights into how to manage couple conflicts. Dr. Graf Grounds is Professor Emeriti in Marriage and Family Therapy, Seattle Pacific University, and a licensed marriage and family therapist in Washington State and California. She has an earned Master of Science and PhD in Sociology from University of Southern California with a dissertation, Family Cohesion, Work Connectedness, Marital Stress, and Work-Family Conflict in Clergy Families. Dr. Graf Grounds has an additional Master of Arts in Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Her initial Bachelor of Arts in Psychology was completed at Stanford University. She is in private practice in San Diego, California, and a published and prolific author, and is well equipped to help us with strategies for managing conflict in marriage. Today's broadcast takes place before a live audience and live streaming while offering practical biblical solutions. It's like having your own Christian mental health relationship doctor within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we now connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Welcome to My Therapist Says, and we want to again welcome our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Claudia Graf Grounds. Welcome, Dr. Claudia. We welcome you this evening, and she is going to, at this time, present the topic this evening, and that is working on how to have a healthy relationship when you're in the midst of a fight. So thank you. Would you join me in thanking her for being here this evening? Thank you.
Well, good evening. It's so wonderful to be with you and share a little bit of my experience with you. I've had an interest in relationships since I was a little person, really interested in how people are very different and how you manage differences. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially with our society at this point in time, right, in 2019. So how do we deal with differences? So I had a discovery. And the discovery came through being able to look at how couple conflict sometimes is an opportunity for growth. So what was that discovery? The discovery is that couples don't have 300 fights. They actually have 3 fights, 100 times each. Now, where did that discovery come from? Well, interesting, it came from being able to look a little bit at our church. Our church was very interested at one point in time in having what we call the First Sunday Family Series, which was to find a Sunday school class similar to My Therapist Says, that would be introducing people to relationship issues. And so one of the people, I was on this commission for the church, they said, Claudia, well, why don't you talk about couples? You do a lot of couples therapy. What do you want to do? So I was thinking to myself, what is a common pattern that I see? What is something that might be really helpful? And especially within a church or faith community, where do people get stuck? And as I was kind of reviewing my work and some of the concerns, I thought to myself, there's patterns. There are different issues that come up. And I came up with those 3 patterns and I taught about it. Well, over the years, those 3 patterns keep coming up in both the research and in my training. One of the areas I do, you heard a little bit about my supervision background. I do a lot of teaching in family therapy, and one area I teach is in couples therapy. And in research recently, in clinical research recently, we're understanding more and more about patterns that couples have and what we need to do. So that was basically the beginning of thinking about writing a book. So the book is We've Had This Fight Before. Anybody in the audience understand that one? Have you ever been in a situation where maybe you're talking about a different topic, but it seems like there's something familiar about it, even it's coming up in different kind of guises. So my interest over time has been looking at what those patterns could be. Now, before we get into the 3 patterns, the 3 fights, and what you want to do about them, I want to give you a little bit of a context and some experiences to relate to this. So there's an exercise I'm going to give you. If you're in the audience, I'd love you to turn to a partner if one's around you. And what you get to do, if you're listening in live stream and you have somebody around you, this would be a good thing to do too, is oftentimes when we think about what's going on with a couple, they come to me as a family therapist, as a couples therapist, and they put out their position. I'm concerned about our money. So if you're a partner here, I want you to one of you put out that concern in front of the other person. And then the other person says, well, you spend too much money, which is the other hand going on top. And, well, you spend too much, and you really, really give too much money to the children. Put another hand on top. We have hand number 3. And the first, yes, you don't even care about me. You care about the kids more often. Number 4, okay? Now you have a stack of 4 hands on top of each other. I do this in couples therapy. I do this in the training with my students. And now I say, now look at the 4 hands. All of you have good points here. Now I want you to think about how would you win your argument. So for a minute, look at your hands. What would you do? When I have students do this, they start having the hand slapping game, and you can hear it in the room. Slap, 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 slap on top of each other. And somebody usually goes, ow, because it hurts a little bit. A lot of times when we have conflicts, we are competing to win by having our point be the point. So then I have you stack the hands again, and I say, could there be any other way to win in the relationship? And if people are thinking about that rather than slapping each other, they turn their hands towards each other and embrace their hands together. They hold on to each other. They've shifted from being a position of me, I need to win, to what do we need to do. So that's a foundation I think about when we're talking about these fights. How do we shape the conflicts to become a we and not just a me? Okay, secondly, research is something I do as a professor. We talk about research around couples. And we have yet a lot of myths about how couples fight. But the research gives us some other information about how couples fight. So let me give you an example of one of the myths that's very common. People come to me and say, there's something wrong with me because we're fighting. Conflict is very, very normal. And it comes from the fact that we're very different people. And that's a natural consequence of difference is that we fight, that we have conflict, we have tension in different kinds of ways. Now, when we think about conflict, we think about happy couples aren't going to have conflict. Happy couples don't fight. A lot of times people come to me in the therapy office and say, there's something wrong with us because we're fighting. So one piece of information that's really interesting about couple conflict comes from John Gottman's work up in University of Washington. He has this thing called a love lab where couples are actually wired up and live in a lab, and they videotape them, and they do research on these encounters, and they watch the couples that stay together, and they watch the couples that get divorced, and they predict from the behaviors they see at point 1 which ones go to divorce, which ones stay together. Interesting kind of research, interesting kind of questions. So one of the things that came from that research is that 69% of couples have fights that are called perpetual, which means they don't get easily resolved. They keep on coming back. They keep on coming back in different ways. Hopefully by the end of the talk today, we'll know where that comes from. They're perpetual. And so happy couples fight just as much as unhappy couples, but they fight differently. How do they fight differently? Well, remember the idea of me to we? Happy couples shift the argument to the we. Happy couples also do a thing that another researcher called a repair attempt. A repair attempt. So when the fight is stuck, they will revisit and come back to the fight to have a productive conversation. So I'm going to give you some hints on how to have those productive conversations when you come back to that conflict. Third, background before we get to the fights is really my own training and my own background. Now, I'm a family therapist, and I've trained family therapists and clinical psychologists, but I've also trained clergy, I've taught in seminary, and I've also trained physicians. I've been in family practice residencies training doctors to have better bedside manners. They could use that sometimes, right? So one of the models that I use is called a biopsychosocial spiritual model. Say that quickly with me. Biopsychosocial spiritual model. Now, that model is something that physicians use. Since the 1960s, physicians are trained in a biopsychosocial model. They know things like stress can cause heart disease. When your psychosocial system, if your work, your social system, causes stress, I'm not doing a very good job, I might get fired, it affects your heart rate, your blood pressure. So we're interrelated humans. So physicians since the 60s have used that as a model. More recently, when we look at cultural context, we know that faith and spirituality and meaning making is also very important to how people function. So the model that I'm using with these 3 fights take into account bio, psychosocial, and spiritual dimensions of people. Because as humans, we're all of those different components. Now, what's interesting is that's actually in the Bible. You're looking at me like, really? I don't think so. I don't think I learned a Bible verse in the Bible about biosocial spiritual models. Well, let's think about this one for a minute. I remember as a kid liking getting stars on my Bible verse ribbon that I would get when I was in elementary school. And one of the early verses I remember was Luke 2:52. And this is the verse. And Jesus increased or grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and in favor with others. I think I learned it, and men at that time. And Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God, favor in man. Now, if we look at the PowerPoint at this point, I think we are, good. What do we see? Jesus grew in wisdom, which has a lot to do with psychosocial components. That would be the 21st century language. Wisdom has a lot to do with how we think and how we behave and how we feel. Wisdom is made out of those categories. Jesus grew in wisdom. He increased. That word in Greek actually is not a smooth word, but it's more like moving a couch when you want to vacuum under it. It's kind of effort to it. Grew or increased in his experiences, in his wisdom. He also grew in stature, which is what? Biology, physical change. He grew in favor in relationship with God and with others. So actually, Jesus models in that verse holistic growth. So something that we need to take into account. We're interrelated human beings. So when I'm thinking about these fights and I'm thinking about therapy, I'm listening to what people are talking about in terms of bio, psychosocial, and spiritual. And in my journey, I've been very grateful to have the opportunity to train physicians, therapists, and clergy in these biopsychosocial models. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't talk to each other. I wish they did more often, because they have different models of making sense of the problems that we confront. But we're integrated people, so thinking about problems in an integrated way is very helpful. So now we move to the 3 fights. What are the 3 fights? And I'm going to give you a little clue on what to do with the 3 fights. There's different skills that you need. So one size doesn't fit all. The skills that might be in one category of fight don't work as effectively in another category of fight. So in the book and in my training, I try to make it simple for you to remember. If you have fight number 1, we're going to have A skills that begin with the word A, with the letter A. Fight 2, B skills, and fight 3, C skills. So you can kind of remember what to do, different things. So what's the first fight? The first fight is, why can't you be more like me? Why can't you be more like me? A lot of times in our life, we have experiences and we argue with our partner how we would handle it, what we would do. And a lot of that comes from our personality, our style, and our behaviors in different ways. Let me give you an example. When my husband and I were first dating, we were in seminary, about 3 months into our relationship, I got into his Volkswagen. We're going to, he had an old Volkswagen, then a rusty floor on the bottom, kind of saw the highway when we would drive by. And he was very poor, as was I. And he handed me, very proudly, a plastic bag of Gorp. Now, Gorp is stuff that people use in backpacking usually. It's got nuts and raisins and chocolate or something like that. Because he had learned that if I'm out with him for a number of hours and I do not eat, I get very cranky. And so he was very proud of himself because he remembered that, and he brought the Gorp to say, I want us to have a good day together, sweetie. This will help us. Now, my husband could go for hours without eating and be totally fine. He'd eat a lot at the end of the day, but he'd be fine. I was not like that. I'm hypoglycemic, so I need to really pay attention to what I eat. So I knew I had a good catch in him because my biology, which was very different from his biology, he started incorporating what? My biology. He started paying attention, making room for the differences in who we were, and loved that enough to pay attention to my needs. Biological needs are things like sleep. Like, are you more extroverted or more introverted? These are hardwired parts of our brains and our bodies. So it's a biological fight. So what do we do with fight number one? Fight number one is associated with A skills. One A skill is called appreciation. Appreciation has to do with the compliment, the difference that your partner brings to you, your wife or your husband brings to you in the relationship. You can appreciate, embrace, understand, accept would be another A word. That there's a difference that's not going to change. You can't usually change that part of that other person. I need more sleep than my husband. He needs less sleep than I do. We're not going to then have an average amount of sleep and both be happy. We can't compromise in that. We have to make room for their differences in our relationship. So fight one has a lot to do with those biological. So up on the screen, I have some ideas on the slide of ways to have a conversation. What are some of the biological differences, the hardwired differences between the two of you that aren't changeable? And how do you start making room for both of you in that relationship? Can there be a benefit to both of you as a result of that? In Galatians, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And some of the fruit of the Spirit, there's kind of a long list. And part of the fruit of the Spirit, I think that it's tied to this capacity to embrace the other, is to be gentle with differences. Gentleness has to do with not changing, but accepting and promoting really what's best in the other person. And that's really the first fight. It has to do with biological differences. So let's move on. What's fight number two? Fight number two, one of the things I put in the book were cartoons. I like cartoons a lot, and it sometimes communicates things in ways that are easier to understand. So this is a cartoon where the bird and the bat who are dating are going to go see the bat's family who are hanging in the cave, and they basically say, something. Can you read it? I can't read it. I'm not so sure I feel comfortable hanging out with your family. The bird is saying that. So fight two has to do with what we call psychosocial differences in a relationship. Whereas fight one has to do with accepting the fact that we have a different hardwiring in our biology, and those differences are going to show up in things like sleep and eating. Fight two has more to do with our social context and how we feel about that social context. So in fight 2, the fight is, why can't you be more like my family? In fight 2, we've learned to live life in lots of different ways. We've learned how to express feelings or to not express feelings. We've learned to pay attention to certain activities and prioritize things and not to other kinds of areas. Another way we think about it is generational legacies or loyalties, where over the patterns over time shape very much the behaviors that we have. An example of that really in my own background and my own training in terms of what fight number 2 might be is well, there's a lot of different examples really between it, but one example in specific would be whether or not to get a car for our 16-year-old. For our 16-year-olds, we have 3 kids. And one of the things that we really paid attention to in our own kind of background is how we're going to parent. In my husband's background, he grew up in a family that was a little less affluent than my family. He earned his own car. He earned all the money for his own car. He got a motorcycle in the very beginning because that's what he could afford. To get to work and own the car. In my family, I got a used car when I was older, and that was a gift and had to pay for insurance and do things like that. But we had differences in our backgrounds and our family in terms of how to parent, how to pay attention to things in our families. So guess what we had a fight about? Parenting around these kinds of areas. It can be a tension area in relationships where you grow up with one family tradition that's very loaded with how you feel and how you act and how you relate to others. That's why we call them psychosocial dimensions in a relationship. And I grew up in a family that was very different from my husband's family around those kinds of things. So we had tension, fights in our relationship because we were talking about how to get a car, how to get insurance, kind of figuring out, is it a gift? Do you pay for it yourself? What kinds of tensions are going on in your relationship? So in fight number 2, why can't you be more like a family? A lot of times you're competing, remember the hand slapping here? You're competing on which family tradition is going to win because you feel deeply about the patterns that you've grown up with. And you have to learn to actually negotiate that. So unlike fight number 1, which is hardwired and probably more biological in our brains and our bodies, fight number 2 has a lot to do with the cultures and the families we grow up in. Has a lot to do with the loyalties and the context that we grow up in. So in fight number 2, we really are going to have to negotiate the differences. And the wish would be for healthy partnering, for the best of kind of both legacies to be brought into the next generation. So we were having fights about cars and figuring out kind of what to do in terms of our background. And what we came up with was kind of a negotiated in-between, so that we had we got our kids' cars, but they had to pay for the insurance and the gas and the upkeep. And we had certain rules for how school was done to be able to do that, certain kinds of expectations what were going on. So we negotiated some of my family legacy, some of my husband's family legacy, to create a new context of being able to be in a relationship. So in fight number 2, what you want to do is look at your own histories and try to kind of find the best of both worlds, marrying those together and negotiating that. This is really a great place where therapy comes in, because in therapy, in psychotherapy and couples therapy, you're doing a lot of negotiating of those differences. In the biological fight, the first one we talked about, you're kind of who you are. There's certain limits to who you are, and some of those are a little less changeable. In the psychosocial parts of fights, there's more negotiation from the cultures and the legacies, the faith values and kind of understanding that you have that's going to be important in your family. So how do you negotiate that? Again, in Galatians, there's this whole idea of the fruit of the Spirit, and one of the areas of fruit of the Spirit is to bring out goodness, what is best, what is something to be celebrated. So in a sense, you're gleaning from each family the best way to be in relationship and passing that down to the next generation if you have children. Fight number 3. This fight, I think, is more of a spiritual fight, even though spirituality shows up in all different dimensions. But it has to do with the fact that there's been legacies of sin done to us and that we do in our own lives. We haven't been parented perfectly. We haven't been around people who are perfect people. There's going to be pain and suffering, trauma and disappointment that will influence us as people. Areas of life that can be very difficult. So the fight number 3 is tied to what we'll call C skills. Didn't talk about the skills. I'll review those in a minute of each fight. And in the fight number 3, we're really talking about why can't you understand my hurt or my suffering? My belief is that every person that comes to therapy, every intimate relationship often is tested around areas of pain or unlovability. And you're wishing in an intimate relationship to find somebody who can love you in your limits. But that's really difficult at times. That's difficult because the sin legacy, in a sense, if we want to talk about religiously, influences not only that person, but also affects the relationship with you. So it's a difficult part to hold in a relationship. So fight number 3 has a lot to do with relational pain. And commonly it doesn't show up right away in couples. It sometimes takes some time to trust each other enough to show our vulnerabilities a little bit more. So let me give you an example of this that my husband allows me to give. When he was a little person, he was probably 5 or so, his parents took him to the park. He's got an older sister, and his parents took him to a park, which was a really big deal. His dad worked many, many hours, and going to the park with the whole family was quite unusual, so he's really excited. And at the end of the time at the park, where they were playing ball and doing different things, his parents and sister talked to each other and say, let's play a trick on my husband. And so they hid. And so my husband, in his 5-year-old little self, was left. Now, that happened at 5, and we'll talk about it in this way. About, I'd say, 4 or 5 years into my marriage, I was going to go to a conference a couple thousand miles away from where we lived. And when I would go to conferences, a lot of times my husband would kind of say, oh, you have to go again, or something like that. He'd complain a little bit or something. But this time it was different. He was kind of more edgy. He's like, I think you're working too much. Do you really have to do this? It had a pointedness to like what was going on. I said, you can be okay. I know, I'll be gone. I got to do this. This is a presentation I need to give. But it was a little more point. I said, and he kept on just like being upset with me. And he was I just couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And I said, what is going on? I'll be back. I've done this before. What is going on? And guess what happened? He remembered that incident that had happened when he was 5. He said, you know what? I'm feeling like that 5-year-old. I don't know why, but I'm feeling like that 5-year-old. And I said, really? And I sat down with him. I said, what's going on? He goes, I don't know. I just feel like you're working too much. Maybe you're not working too much. I just somehow don't want to be alone. I said, okay, I understand that. Because that little 5-year-old part of him somehow got activated. That part of him that was younger somehow got touched by me leaving this time. It wasn't rational. it was a trigger in him. So I sat down with him and I said, do you need me not to go? I understand you're really scared. What's going on? How can I help? He goes, no, you need to do this presentation. You have to get your thing done for, work, and you have to do this. But I said, come back early. He goes, no, why don't you just call me more often when you're away? I said, I can do that. And if you need me to come back, I'll come back if we really need to do that. So in this fight, the more vulnerable parts of ourselves are brought to our spouse, are brought to our partner. And during that time, we have this opportunity to repair, from a theological perspective, sin that had been done to the person in our relationship. We can love them instead of scare them if we choose to. Now, it's not by chance, in my opinion, that high divorce rates happen around year 2 or year 3, because I think that's when people trust each other enough to become more vulnerable. So some of these issues get activated relationally, and most people, especially in our culture, that's very practical, don't see the underlying need to attach. So this brings in the C skills. C skills would be one example of a C skill in fight number 3 is a commitment in the relationship, a choice to commit to be in the relationship, to be attached over a longer period of time, because many things can be repaired in a relationship from history if there's that commitment. It's the hardest part. In our society, we have a higher divorce rate partly because this spiritual practice of going through and working on deeper needs in relationships often are not addressed. We address things more practically. So if we review the 3 fights, and then I'll review the skills that are associated with them. The 3 fights are biological fights, we talked about in the beginning, which has to do with how we're more hardwired as people, and the difference between the way I'm hardwired and the way my partner is, my husband is. And the ideas are A skills, things like acceptance and appreciation for that difference. B skills come from fight number 2. Why can't you be more like my family? Has to do with being able to commit, become an intentional negotiator to bring the best from both families into this new family that you're creating. It brings goodness in the relationship. Fight 3, why can't you understand my pain, has to do with skill set C, things like committing in that relationship. So there's 3 different fights that come up and different skills that are needed for people to go through the different fights. So rather than 300 fights, many couples have themes in their fights that are 3 fights: biological, psychosocial, and spiritual fights that get played out in that relationship and have an opportunity to be healed and dealt with in productive ways as you learn to step in to those relationships with that in mind. So there's a book that you can look at. We've had this fight before, which talk about kind of a history of myths that we have in the research, and then talk about the A, B, and C skills from the different kinds of fights and problems that we have. So thank you for listening so attentively, and we'll go to some questions and answers.
Thank you. Dr. Claudia, would you join me in thanking her for a wonderful presentation? Wonderful. And we do have questions. I have at least one. There's another handout. There's 2. There's several people with their questions that'll be brought up to us. I'd like to start, if I may, a wonderful, wonderful, helpful presentation. And obviously, as a pastor's wife, and you've been in ministry full-time with your husband over the years and worked with lots of people within the church, you have a keen insight because of that avenue of ministry. Could we start with the idea of why can't you be more like me? And we talked about some specific things like sleep, temperament, appreciation, this idea of appreciating the other person, but temperament. why do we get, let's start there. Why do we get stuck in that biological, the hardwiring that we bring in to the marriage, even at the point that our temperament is fairly stable? That's why I think you said that, is fairly stable throughout our life. If we're more extroverted by nature, we see that with mothers with children, with a child in her womb, where she'll even talk about, wow, I kind of sensed that before the child was birthed, and that stays
Very much so.
steady, correct? That's why you use temperament, and then the idea of sleep, or the different biological makeups of the individuals. Why, can you help us to get into a little more understanding, why do we get stuck, say, in a fight with that? I know you're saying, why can't you be more like me? So I'm wanting the other person to be like me. Can you help us, why do we get stuck in that fight? What causes us to be stuck there?
Well, I think there's multiple reasons. The main one, I think, is when we really partner well in a relationship, our life isn't just totally about us, which was kind of the wonderful gift that my husband gave by bringing Gorp on our date. You know, it was his biology wasn't my biology, but to be partnered well, we make room, we actually expand ourselves to be different than we are. And there's a certain amount of gentleness and humility that comes with recognizing I'm not the only way to be. And we don't see the complement. We see the competition in the difference as opposed to the complement, or making room for both people. So I think in our culture we are very competitive generally. And so if our style is comfortable, we think everybody needs to be doing the same thing. And I think that's part of the difficulty. We don't see the unique creation that each person is and make room for that. So we expect that. And it's partly a stress, on a personal level, it's a stress reduction mechanism, because we know this brings me comfort, but it may not bring you comfort. But I'm expecting you to use my comfort-making mechanism to be able to do that. I think you've had my therapist says about that kind of idea. And it's important for us to make kind of a room. We're competitive. We expect it to be kind of our way. And we don't see the complement, where the complement can be very helpful. It was very helpful when my kids are little. My husband needs less sleep and is a morning person, and I need more sleep and I'm a night person. So he could take morning duty more, and I would take night duty. So at moments, that difference is very functional. But if we're going on vacation, he wants to get up at 6 and start going, and I'm not up, So there's differences in that biology that sometimes are easier to negotiate and harder to negotiate or accept or make room for.
So that complementarity, that complementing the other person, isn't that similar in a way to the way we function in faith? Like we take a step of faith toward the Lord. I know there's different views theologically about that. However, we do take a step of faith. And in a way, that's complementing the fact that we realize that we are not full in ourselves. We really need the Lord in our lives. Is that sort of what you're referring to? That's part of a spiritual part of it? That's the complementarity piece within a couple. They're taking that step of faith emotionally toward each other?
Yeah, there can definitely be that, and a lot around giftedness. Certain people are gifted in one domain and are not gifted in another from a faith perspective, too. And to expect you to have my gift, Paul talks about that even in Corinthians in terms of, you're not like me. We have different gifts, and we all need each other. And I think that's true in a relationship.
Why do couples get stuck? I think I've seen that, I'm sure you have in your practice as well, where couples will get stuck in the competing. And I know you've mentioned that, and then this is complementarity, which is looking more, when we look at the first fight, is appreciation and then acceptance. You were using Galatians 5, with the fruits of the Spirit. Why do some couples get caught and stuck in the competition? And I see it so frequently. I know your book probably shares a bit about that and your background. Can you help us to understand that? Why do we seem to get stuck in that?
Well, humans have a lot of mechanisms around being along with people that are similar to them and have difficulties. See that in church conflicts, are you Jew or Greek or slave or free? All these different patterns, socially prescribed patterns of differences. So I think we have just a lot of competition in terms of how we think about life. And part of that, distinctive of especially marriage relationships and intimate commitments, is the two becoming one, is that you're joining forces in your differences to create something that's different than you were all by yourself. And that's a struggle. That's a hard thing to do. So we're very competitive in our culture. Other cultures, I think other cultures actually do some of this better because they step into saying people have differences, let's use the complement. We have a competitive kind of style in our culture, so we kind of get into who's going to win versus we win by being complementary.
I love that concept, Dr. Claudia. You're talking about joining forces. In other words, the strengths. So joining the strengths of your mate. Your mate has strengths, you have strengths. There's a tendency, I guess, with groupthink or this idea that we want to gather people around us. I remember the first couple I ever saw, and I asked them a simple question, and I was really young and inexperienced. And I said, can you tell me what you have in common? I think that would be a normal question, but it was not a very helpful question because they looked at me and they said,
Not much.
Not much. Or they said, we don't have anything in common.
Yeah.
And of course, I've learned since then, that was not a very bright question, by the way, but is that I've learned since that helping people see that it's a wonderful phrase, their strengths become their greatness as a couple, and really realizing the strength of the other person. In the business world, they'll teach leaders this idea of groupthink, which there's a tendency to hire someone just like yourself. And what it does is it creates really entropy in your organization, because then you're moving toward chaos because you don't have that second set of eyes and his or her opinions that help. That's why I always say with couples that they need both sets of eyes, but they're going to vary.
Yeah.
And they're going to have different views because of their alliances and some of their experiences growing up. So
Well
that's
said.
it's a wonderful way. Well, let's dive into a couple of the questions that they have. And this is a starting question. This is from the audience, of course. And any more questions, please feel free to raise your hand if you don't have a 3x5 card but would like to write another question, and we'll get you another card. This first question asks, how can a couple work toward marriage without conflict? So it's suggesting that we would be conflict-free. How do you respond to that? Because actually the Gottman Institute helps us to see that actually conflicts can be our friend.
That's right.
Yes.
I don't think the goal is conflict-free. And I think somehow that's in the air in certain cultures. I do remember when I was in college dating a guy, and his parents were very proud, and they told me we never fight. And they were so proud. And part of me was like, really? But I knew them pretty well over a period of time, and they would get silent at times, or they would walk into different rooms at times. So at least from my perspective, that fights are not necessarily loud or overt or verbal.
Right.
Fights show up, differences show up in different ways, and how do you handle them? So I don't think the goal necessarily is to not have conflict or not fight, but have productive fights. And most of the research now is really wonderful around the fact that if you can repair what is first seen as a fight, or it feels really uncomfortable, and I'm trying not to say that fights are all beautiful and wonderful. They're not. They can be very, very destructive at times. But the seeds of many relationship tensions and conflict areas, there's this wonderful opportunity for it to be a way of loving another person, recognizing they've been created by God in unique ways, in ways that you have not been, and that's going to help you in life. So it's embracing a much bigger picture. It helps us, I think, with fight number 2, when we're talking about that you grew up in a family and I grew up in a family, and you can start taking the best of both families in your new family if you're intentional to negotiate that. That brings goodness and healing and redemptive kinds of processes. So there's wonderful opportunities in fights, and they feel different when there's been positive ways of dealing with the conflicts, even though those conflicts still exist all the way through a relationship.
Yes, so you're really talking about how we can begin to respond to our mate rather than react to our mate. Because your husband's story, that's very painful, that he felt apparently, I don't know for sure, but apparently complete abandonment, even though they were being playful. It was misguided in a way of how he experienced that. So now he became reactive toward you, even though it was an innocuous situation. You both had agreed you were going to be speaking at a conference or attending a conference, and yet he had a reaction to that, and that's where we see a lot of couples, don't we?
Right.
That they have that reaction. So even that first A way of finding appreciation, and you said the B one is goodness, but the first one is, I believe you said, acceptance and appreciation, being able to pause and respond to your mate rather than react, and to be able to see that B part, which is the goodness, or the A part was the acceptance, and the word is appreciation you used. That's tough to do, isn't it? How do you help your clients, how do you help your patients when they're having a difficult time, say, doing the A fight, and that's the ability to appreciate and accept? You're doing this in gentleness, and you're promoting the best of the other person.
Right.
When they cannot do that, they become reactive, like your husband and you.
Right.
You were able to sit down, of course, and you even illustrated for us how you were able to validate your husband and do some wonderful things. Can you help us when we become too reactive, when we're not able to find that appreciation or acceptance in a mate?
Yeah, well, the fight C is the most difficult, and it takes a certain amount of, I think, spiritual maturity or discipline to step into that very well. So it has a lot to do with empathy and mirroring and compassion, being able to, and you can't appreciate, you just have to sit with. It's like if a kid is feeling really, really awful, sometimes you have to sit with them in their awful feeling. You don't do anything with it. You're there with them. So a lot of those areas, the fights that are most painful, the idea of compassion and empathy and sitting with before fixing is really important. So as a partner, it's like, wow, it felt that awful to you? Tell me more. What was that story in your background, if you have any memory, that kind of feels like what we're having right now in our conversation? So I think it's a different set of skills than appreciation or acceptance. It has a lot more to do with empathy, compassion, and recognizing in intimate relationships we become an agent of grace, potentially, of care in the relationship. And if it's a good relationship, it's mutual, that wherever our vulnerabilities or pains are, our partner can have compassion for that, can have care for that, are more gentle or tender with that, realizing we're going to be more reactive. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen again, but how we respond. And that takes some real, both spiritual and emotional maturity to handle fight 3, because oftentimes it's very ugly and very pointed and harsh. Also, all of these 3 fights can load up on each other. I talk about the big fight, and the big fight is when fight 1, we're my own style and my family style and my hurt place all put together, and those can be very painful fights. So you have to, really take a breath and step back and slowly review where all these different parts kind of commingle, and so it's difficult to do. But I think the third fight is definitely the most taxing in a relationship and the most difficult to do.
Could we use an example? You talked about your son, you and your husband, and your son at 16. I believe you used that in the illustration of your husband was not used to getting a car. He bought his own car, bought his own motorcycle.
Right.
And you have your son at 16, he's 16 years of age.
Right.
Let's suggest for a moment, I'd like for you to, if you could, demonstrate empathy and goodness, all of that toward me. Say I'm play acting as your husband, but I'm very upset. Could you show, because it could get you upset if I'm upset because it's your son.
Right.
May we play act
All
that?
3 kids. We had this fight with all 3 of our children, so we didn't learn real well. No, just kidding.
So this would be a good one to illustrate. But I'm wanting, if we could, the audience to be able to see your empathy. This is sometimes a very difficult thing for a person to do. So I'm going to act in a way probably your husband never has acted.
Okay.
I'm play acting here, and I'm acting as though I'm upset that you actually decided to pay for our son's car. Okay? Can I move it that
Sure.
direction? Okay.
In our example, just to
Yes.
shape it a little bit, that was more of the fight number 2,
that was the fight
psychosocial,
two.
which would be more like, you grew up in a family, my husband grew up in a family tradition where you need to earn it yourself. I grew up in a family tradition that was a little more affluent. There was more resources. So we
Yes.
were negotiating how to do that, and we had to figure out with tension, what do we want to do with our own children? So they got a used car, and they had to contribute insurance, and they had to do certain things and keep their grades up. And so we used kind of the best of both of our worlds, of our family worlds, to figure out how to support our children in their stage. So that was really fight 2. For him, it wasn't so activated with fight number 3, more of his own, like, he doesn't have trauma about that.
Okay, because number 3 is more of the trauma,
More of the trauma,
pain from the past
pain
that's
from the-
triggered.
right.
Could we go to 2 then?
Okay.
And let's suggest that you said to your son that you were going to pay for all of his gas. And I disagree with that.
Okay.
Because when I grew up, I really needed to pay for that. And I'm
Yeah.
really upset about it. And all I'm asking is to illustrate how you would show empathy toward, I'm play acting,
Yeah.
toward your husband when he's really upset, and he may never become this upset.
Okay, so go for it.
Okay, thank you. So, well, and your son's name, or maybe we'll just make up a name, Frank.
Okay, Frank.
So Frank, so I heard that Frank, this is fight number 2, right? I heard that Frank, he told me that you're paying for his gas. We agreed that we were going to pay for his insurance. He was going to raise the money and pay for that. And I'm really upset. How could you have done that?
Yeah.
You did that without my agreement. And
Yeah.
you've gone ahead and done that for our son. And now, I mean, I never had that happen when I grew up. And we agreed that we would try to blend. You're the therapist, so we're trying to blend the amount of here. But I'm the pastor, but I just want you to know that. But anyway, trying to blend this.
Right.
And so I don't get it. Why did you do that?
Yeah, well, he needed the money, and so I guess that's what I started with, was he needed the money, but you're really right. I didn't think about both of our concerns there. I was just thinking about he needed to go to work. He had an empty gas tank, so I just paid for it, and I really broke the rules. So I like the fact that your family had a tradition of you having to earn your way. I think my family didn't do that enough. So I really like that you want to bring that to our children, because that's actually important to learn how to do, and I think that would have been better for me. So I'm sorry, I didn't, I just was not thinking. I was kind of doing my old way of family of just paying for things when I could, so I really messed up there.
Well, I really appreciate you taking ownership. Now, can I just real quickly, nicely done. This is beautifully illustrated empathy. Can we now take what you just did? We're starting to clap. Take what you actually did, and let's describe what you did in that empathy behavior. First of all, didn't you responded to my question why you behaved in the way you did, right? So you responded to the question, trying to be realistic in what you did. You were taking ownership of what you did. Can you tell us some more of your behaviors that were showing empathy? Because I felt that empathy as we were even play acting here.
Right. So empathy is part of what's always helpful in response, to mirror back to the person what they're bothered by and know that they're bothered. So somehow you communicate like you're not dismissing it, but you're noticing. So it does touch fight number 3, which has a lot to do with empathy or compassion. That's not a bad thing to ever have operating in terms of relationship.
Sure.
But then I kind of went back to the deal that we had struck, which I had violated. The deal we had made, the negotiation from your family and my family, I violated by just paying the money and not having him pay the money, my son pay the money. So I'd have to, the ownership wasn't so much that I did that, I was failing to kind of pay attention to what was needed there, but I had violated the contract of the connection between the two of you. Or maybe I would have said, if I had known this, I paid for him, but he's paying us back in his next paycheck. So but you didn't know that. So sorry, I didn't tell you that. I did follow the rules, but you didn't know that at the time when you were upset about me paying for the tank of gas.
Yes, did you notice also Dr. Claudia was able to, my perception and experience was that you were able to to show appreciation and accept the fact that your family is different than my family. I'm play acting as your husband here. Yeah, and so the two families are very different, and recognizing that we're trying to draw from the best of both. Now, a key thing which a lot of couples do not do is they do not talk about expectations. I don't know if in your practice that's one of the number one things that
really important.
New couples, newlyweds, they're working on issues. In other words, expectations are, one, do we put the rinsed dishes in the sink and then go to bed, and in the morning put them in the dishwasher?
Yes.
Or do we not even rinse them and put them in the sink? And of
or
course,
my favorite, does the toilet paper roll this way
or
this
that way? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the way you do that, this way or that way? Okay.
This way is the right way, by the way.
By the way, that's right. And that's really fight number 3. Well,
that's 2.
That's 2, excuse me. I think I'm a B+ student here. Anyway, on fights, why can't you be more like me? And then, of course, why can't you be more like my family? Is the second one, excuse me, isn't? Yes, and then 3.
So those patterns of things like, washing the dishes are very clearly ingrained in us from when we're little people, in terms of how neat is neat and how clean is clean and how many people do you have over. It's very much lived life that are different, and becoming intentional about that is unusual. Most people think it's going to be the same way, and so those expectations aren't spoken often.
Yes, because we have muscle memory, we have emotional memory. Early on we just watch our parents, this is the way you wash the tires, or this is the way you mow the lawn, or this is the way.
Powerful.
And so it is an automatic reaction.
Yeah.
So that reaction comes into the marriage, and then we will become reactive toward our mate because they are not reacting the same way we are.
Right. Why can't you be more like my family? Right? Because that's the fight, is that it's embodied in us, and in our behavior, and in our feelings, and in our thoughts about what's going on. So the negotiation, the becoming a we, at least in that one, is a more negotiation. Fight A, I think it's a very different thing with biology, is you kind of have to accept what it is. I mean, if my husband never accepted that I was hypoglycemic, it's harder to do life with him. If he didn't get that, I need to eat certain things. The positive part of that is I think we eat healthier because of paying attention to that. And he would say the same thing. So that the fights need different things. The fights need different skills. So you're talking about the negotiation with the family, which is very important.
So it was important in that discussion. Of course, I was play acting. We both were that you had negotiated with your husband as to how you and he would behave towards your son and the car.
Right. So how we would parent around something like a big purchase or a big responsibility.
Yes. And so what happens to a lot of couples is they've not taken the time to negotiate, and you use that word so well, to negotiate what are the expectations. I see it in the church here at Skyline, that a lot of times people sit in the same places. One of the reasons we do that, there are many reasons we do that. More convenient, we just feel comfortable. But one is it de-escalates our anxiety if we know that we will have a seat to sit in this auditorium. And so if we expect something to be like we think it will be, we have less anxiety. That's why expectations are so important, particularly in a marriage, because those expectations can be either your friend. Like that discussion, you were able to revert back to, we had made this decision. We talked about this expectation. So part of the Gottman Institute, of which Dr. Claudia was speaking, refers to how does the couple do repairs, which you shared, and then how do they do that on a daily basis? Like a great conversation could be, say you're with a group of people and you go back to your home, and you ask, hey, was there anything else you'd like for us to do different when we're with that group maybe the next time? I don't know. Well, you really want me to answer that? Yes, I'd like for you to answer that. Well, I felt like when the couple was talking, I don't know, for whatever reason, I experienced you talking a lot, and I began to feel uncomfortable. I was embarrassed. Those were my feelings.
Yeah.
Now, if the couple is able to do like Dr. Claudia's doing, she's really listening to me, is she's staying present, and we're able then to go, wow, I wonder where, you might say something, where that embarrassment is coming from. And we might discover that is part of
Fight 3.
Fight 3.
Yeah.
why cannot you understand my hurt?
Yeah.
Because I remember watching my parents talk, and it was actually my father that, I'm making this up, this is not true, but my father would talk a lot, and I would get embarrassed as I watched that. And now we just came from a group, a couple that we really enjoy.
Yeah,
and
but they did that.
And I felt embarrassed. You were talking, and it was you.
Yeah.
What do you think about that,
Yeah,
Dr.
it's
Claudia?
wonderful, wonderful. And I think that's what happens is sometimes there's segues in the conversation where something that seems so practical at one level actually gets a little deeper, emotionally, a little bit more vulnerable. And marriages and relationships that do well can start moving into that new territory. And the ones that don't, I think that's part of why we have a divorce rate that we have. They don't know how to move into those conversations that are deeper. They don't know how to commit to that relationship in a way that's more satisfying. So it's a challenge, and it takes a lot of maturity to do that.
Yes. This is a wonderful discussion. The next question here from our audience is, and it seems like a simple question, but you've heard this one before, as I have, I'm assuming. I want to negotiate, but my spouse says, we're done talking. That's not funny, really. But that happens to a lot of couples, and it says, do you have a suggestion? So I want to negotiate something with my spouse. However, my spouse says, we're done talking.
Right.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So that I think taking time out as a couple is a really important skill, just like it is with your children. That you need to have them know how to take time out.
Yes, to self-regulate, right?
Yeah, and to self-regulate, and there's a lot of benefits. So as long as it's a for now, not forever comment, I think it's a very helpful comment to know how to do that. So we're done talking for now. We do need to find a time where we can talk a little more about this, because it doesn't feel like we've created a we solution here yet. And if they do finally get together and have a we solution, then they need to kind of commit to practicing that for a while. They can't change it all the time. So it's going to take a few months to try something new, some pattern. So there's kind of a couple different layers there. So I think a lot of times especially like extroverts and introverts, an extrovert wants to keep talking because that's their energy. They get energized by that. And the introvert wants to say, stop.
That's enough. Yes.
So that's that fight number one.
Yes.
So that couple needs to make space for both of them. One needs to talk and one needs to talk less, but they do need to talk if they're negotiating or figuring out things, where and when and how. We know from some of the literature that 50% of fights would go away if the couple decided what they're talking about and when to talk about it. So they'd have a more productive conversation. So just those things, because one person wants to talk about it now and the other person says, no way, and so that actually creates another level of fight. They're not talking about what they're fighting about, but that they're fighting about not wanting to talk about it. So that's very common. Very common. So that's kind of figuring out. So what I'll do with some couples who have this, they'll go to some place like Starbucks on a Saturday, and they'll have a half an hour conversation. Because they're in a public setting, they have to be kind of civil, and they, and so they find that constraint of a public setting for a half an hour, talking about a specific topic that they both agree that is important for them to talk about. That limit setting and that negotiation creates more productive conversation than keep talking and don't talk at all, impasse. So it's a very common, understandable difference.
And as you were talking about the extrovert versus introvert, the extrovert, you were saying, likes to talk, and maybe she or he understands what they believe or are thinking as they talk.
Yes.
The introvert is, on the other hand, perhaps going more inward.
Yes.
And they need more time to process that, because they're absorbing it without saying something. And it could be, if one is more introverted, would you say, and you find the extroverted spouse continuing on is just validating. The introvert could just validate. So what I hear you saying, Dr. Claudia, is this, and that slows it down a bit, and then the extrovert knows that she or he, in this case she, is being heard.
Yes.
And that can be helpful.
Yeah.
In that spacing. Again, it's finding the best in each, right?
And that one's fight number one, which is making room for both. That fight number one, it's not, I'm going to change you. You're not going to become a real talkative person if
Right.
you're not. But can we make space
Yes.
for both of us to get part of what we need,
Yes,
as
finding-
opposed to competing to do it my way or your way only?
Yes.
And it's a hard one.
Yeah, you're talking about finding the best, aren't you? That was that negotiate differences and legacies, but it's finding the best in each. This next question, we have a few more minutes left for this evening. We end right at 8 p.m., is that you mentioned winning the fight,
Yeah.
this question. You really are not trying to win a fight, correct?
Correct.
It's a great question. Maybe for us to just tease out a little bit more of that when it's winning the fight. Help us to maybe understand a little more of your theory and your background in helping couples with this. So again, the question is, or it's more of a statement in a way, you mentioned winning the fight, but the question is, you really are not trying to win a fight, correct?
Yeah, just to clarify. So that first experiential exercise we did, which was kind of saying, I've got these points and now win, the most common response is keep slapping to be on top. So that idea of winning, for most people, is that competitive. We were going back to competition and individual. We have an individualistic culture, so winning and competing is really important. So in winning the fight, I am definitely saying we need to create a we. So we around biology, which means you're not going to be like me in all ways.
Yes.
A we around bringing the best from both of our family traditions. A we around care and compassion for the vulnerable parts, the stories of our own histories that kind of get activated between us.
Yes.
So we're trying to make room for all of that in our relationship as we commit to grow together. So yes, winning means that we shift how we're doing this as a we, as something that we do together versus just
together.
individually.
Again, it's finding the best, you're saying, so it's we, moving from me to we. The final question for the evening here, it came from the audience, is how can a couple work toward marriage without conflict? And I knew you've already addressed that in a way, but is it possible for a couple to work toward marriage without a conflict? I had a university couple, they just proposed, he had proposed to her, and they came and said, Prof, will you work with us? And so one of my first questions is, tell me about your first conflict. And they kind of looked, the deer in the headlights, looked at each other, looked at me. We had a pause, kind of a pregnant pause for just a moment there. And then they said, we don't fight. We don't have conflict. We love each other. And so I said, well, let's try. Why don't you have your first fight and then come back, and then we'll begin our work. And so they did come back, so that was wonderful. But when we think about the idea when, love is in the air, at university it's usually spring like it is now, and you sing, love is in the air, and people are drooling across the campus, these are university campuses, sorry. But the idea is that they just see everything in a glossy, it's a wonderful, beautiful moment, and they don't see the conflict as a source of strength for their potential marriage. Yeah. So are you able to respond to that? We have just about 2 minutes left here, but any other thoughts that you have about that?
Yeah, I think, so I do believe there's, however we want to talk about it, there is conflict. If there's no conflict, then the distinctives of who we are probably are not showing up. Somebody's not having voice in the relationship very well, because inherently we're created uniquely by God with differences. So there's moments in which that difference will show up, and that's what I would call conflict. Yeah. So I think it's the part of creation, and it can be a very positive part of creation depending on how you manage that, respond in love around that, or whether or not you try to do your way versus the other partner's way.
Yeah, that's the hand on top of the other hand, and one trying to beat the other. This is wonderful, and in her book, she will have these books available right after this presentation. We've had this fight before. Dr. Claudia Graff Grounds, PhD, licensed marriage and family therapist. This is her book. This will be a great presentation. If you have a young couple, friends, people that have been married 20 or 40 or 50 years who are finding difficulty with how to fair fight, this would be a great work for them. This was a wonderful presentation. I want to thank you, Dr. Claudia,
thank you so much,
for your
Don.
Presentation this evening. What a wonderful delight to have you this evening. And I just wanted to mention before we close this evening that on Tuesday, May 7, we have Dr. Jennifer Konzen, Healthy Sexuality and Marriage, what to do when marriage conflict impacts sexuality. We thought this would be a great follow-up to this presentation. So I hope that you will let others know about that presentation. It will be held here in the main auditorium of Skyline Wesleyan Church here in San Diego, California. May I close our evening with a word of prayer. Thank you again for coming this evening to My Therapist Says. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, the gift of marriage, what a beautiful gift it is. You created it to be a bit of heaven on earth when it is working well. And when it is not working well, it can be terrific. It can be very, very painful. And so thank you this evening for Dr. Claudia Graff Grounds and her background and experience in this as she is helping us to learn how to have healthy conflict management, particularly in marriage. So bless everyone that has listened to this. We thank you for your presence, Father, that makes all the difference in each of our lives. And it is we rather than me. And particularly for a Christian marriage, it must be a we that includes you. So we thank you for that. In the name of Jesus, I pray this evening. Amen. Once again, thank you for coming to My Therapist Says.